Prime Minister and Health Minister. Today has been another day of hope. Yesterday, 335,420 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine were administered here in Australia. Another record day. Records that give us the hope that the national plan can take us to. It means being able to join with other Australians as we go through the balance of this year. It means businesses having the confidence to be able to know that they can come through, and that their financiers and their investors can have that same confidence, that people will be able to get those hours back and go back to work, that people can get on the bus again and on the tram again and go to work, that performers can get on the stage at live venues again, that people can gather in restaurants, and they can do it not just for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, but know that that can be their life again going forward, and we can have the certainty. Our national plan is a safe plan. It's the safe plan to ensure that Australia can open up again with confidence. 18 million people have now had, 18 million doses have now been administered in Australia. 1.9 million in the past week alone. 55% have had their first dose, and we will finish this week with more than a third of Australians having had both doses, and that has increased significantly in the last 2 months. We keep that pace up over the next 2 months, and we're really going to make a big dent in this. I want to make clear also, and I will do so after I've touched on the very important matters in Afghanistan. 12 to 15-year-olds in Australia will be vaccinated, and later today the National Security Committee of Cabinet, which meets on COVID matters specifically, will be considering that plan coming forward from General Fruin, which is consistent with the interim advice we've received from ATAGI. We're expecting final advice from ATAGI very, very soon, and that will enable us to move forward with the vaccination of 12 to 15-year-olds. There's 1.2 million across Australia, and you can see that when we can get 1.8 million doses done in just a week, then the task of ensuring that we can also, in parallel, vaccinate 1.2 million 12 to 15-year-olds and achieve the levels that we would need to achieve there is a task that is certainly well within the capability of the vaccination program. So it is a safe plan, and we're proceeding with it. It's also pleasing to know that the South Australian home quarantine pilot is now underway in South Australia, and I want to thank Premier Marshall for the great work he's done there.
Thanks very much, Prime Minister and Maurice. A record day of vaccinations, as the Prime Minister said, 335,000 vaccinations and now over 18 million doses delivered. Very significantly, what we've seen is 6.7 million doses in 30 days. Melbourne, Adelaide, Wollongong in 30 days. And so these are real numbers that are bringing safety and protection and hope to all Australians everywhere. That this message that each dose protects the individual, but every dose protects all of us, is a profoundly important message to Australians across the country. We're closing on 10 million primary care doses. Our GPs, our pharmacists, our Indigenous medical services, they're doing an amazing job, and I want to thank them in particular. They have worked tirelessly. In addition to that, our over 50s now, 76.7%, over 60s, 81.6%, and our over 70s, 86.2%. And in the epidemiology update I had this morning from the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Paul Kelly, what that showed is that in the New South Wales outbreak, this is leading to very different outcomes from a year ago in Victoria. Challenges, of course, but the vaccinations are saving lives and protecting lives.
Thank you. Prime Minister, all 12 to 15-year-olds have the opportunity to be vaccinated, and given the transmissibility of Delta has cast doubt on Doherty's advice that they don't change the outcome of the modelling, why not include them in the national targets?
Well, on the first point, as I said, the plan for the vaccination of 12 to 15-year-olds will be considered by the National Security Committee of Cabinet on COVID matters later today, and I'll be advising the government's decisions on that to the National Cabinet tomorrow for proceeding with that plan, so there'll be more details following. You would expect after that plan has been considered, decisions made, and then we can advise accordingly. So there'll be further advice following on that. But I want to be very clear, we understand, particularly for parents with 12 to 15-year-olds, they want to know. They want to know, firstly, that any vaccine that they would have would be backed in by the expert advice that those vaccines can be provided to 12 to 15-year-olds. Now, we have some interim advice which is very favourable on that score, but we expect the final advice very soon to be consistent with that, and that enables us to move forward with the plans that have been being prepared now for some weeks. And as I said, we'll confirm those later today as a National Security Committee of Cabinet and make further announcements about that at the appropriate time. In relation to the other matter you raised, no, I don't share your view, and the Doherty Institute have also made their own comments on the assertions made in the question. So I'll refer you to their comments about their own modelling and what they have been saying. What they've consistently said to the National Cabinet and to the federal government in particular, that the rates of vaccination across the border population over 16 give us the indication of the level of vaccination ready needed to be able to move to Phase B and Phase C. But that does not, by implication, say there is no need to vaccinate children 12 to 15. And that will be a very clear decision of my government that we will need to go ahead and vaccinate children 12 to 15. And so these two objectives are not working against each other. I see them working completely together with each other. And there are different rates of vaccination in the Doherty modelling. Those who are very familiar with it will know that as you go across the age cohorts, as to understanding what their expectation is of what does 70% overall look like, what does 80% overall look like, there are different rates of vaccination by different age groups. And obviously those who have the highest rates of vaccination in those scenarios are those who are in the older age groups, who are the most vulnerable to death. And as the Health Minister has just observed, the fact that we have had in aged care facilities doubled those vaccination rates now, I think 84%, and when you compare the terrible fatalities we saw last year in the Victorian outbreak compared to the Sydney outbreak this year, it is a factor of 8 to 1, thereabouts. And so the vaccines have clearly been doing their job in protecting people, particularly in residential aged care facilities, who were the primary, almost overwhelmingly exclusive casualties of that wave in Victoria last year. So the vaccination and the vaccines are doing their job, and the fact that 1 in 3 Australians over the age of 16 by the end of this week will be vaccinated, that we are a long way, we have come forward a long way in these last few months as we've dealt with the challenges in the program and achieving what are now world rate performances when it comes to our vaccinations as a share of our population. Lani.
Building a quarantine facility in WA at Bullsbrook, 3 kilometres from a contaminated site, where groundwater won't be able to be used and you'll have to ship the water in. Would you let your family stay there?
Well, if we were flying into Perth and we were quarantining in Perth and that's what we had to do, then of course I'd go there if that's what was required. And the facility that we are now looking at has proven necessary because the one at Jandakot wasn't able to be secured on the appropriate terms and conditions. And so we have moved with another facility that meets the national guidelines that we'd set out for getting that program moving forward. Mark.
Premier Palaszczuk's just announced that she will fund the quarantine facility at Wellcamp because your government won't, and that she'll use it as a replacement for hotel quarantine, not as an addition to that. What's your response?
Well, she's been at liberty to do that for months. We've made it very clear that that facility did not meet the national guidelines, and that's why we're going together forward together at Pinkenba. But the Queensland Government was always in a position to go ahead with that facility if that's what they wish to do, and to have people quarantine there rather than in hotel facilities. That is entirely a matter for the Queensland Government, and they've made that decision, and they could have done that months ago if that's what they wish to do. But good for them, and I wish them every success.
Prime Minister, we know the vaccine, just back to the vaccine rollout, we know that the rollout has been lagging for some of our most vulnerable communities, for NDIS participants, for Indigenous communities. Do you think we need to rethink the national plan so that we don't just move to the next phases at 70% and 80% of population-wide coverage, but rather when we also have much higher rates for those incredibly vulnerable cohorts? So 95%, for instance.
I understand the question, and I understand the concern that many Australians will have that at 70% and 80%, even at those general average levels, that means 20 and 30% of the population over 16 will still be unvaccinated. And you are right to note that there will be other cohort sections of the population which will have differing rates of vaccination as well. The Doherty analysis takes that into account in the recommendations that it has made, and that is why I've noted on many, many occasions that measures will remain available to protect particularly vulnerable populations with stronger restrictions that may be necessary to protect those particular populations in those cases. So highly targeted actions and things of that nature, that is contemplated in the national plan. The national plan contemplates and understands the need to continue to address the most vulnerable in the community. And it is a dynamic plan to that extent, that it understands that there is just not one homogenous population in Australia. What the overall levels of vaccination targets indicate, though, is that when you reach that level of vaccination, like you do with any immunisation, the immunisation against serious infectious diseases doesn't just protect the vaccinated, it actually protects the unvaccinated as well. And that's why you have to lift your vaccination levels to those scales, 70 and 80%. Let's not forget that even at 70%, which is an easing in to the full 80% measures, that is still a mark higher than most of the other countries, if not all, that have gone into their next phases, be it in the UK or other places. We have actually set the mark generally higher and higher again for the 80%, and also acknowledging that in our most vulnerable populations, which is the elderly population, we'll be seeing vaccination rates, double doses, well in excess of 80 and even 90%. But where there are particular groups, such as Indigenous communities and groups like that, then the plan absolutely and totally is designed to ensure that specific protections are provided in and around those communities where those challenges present. So the plan actually accommodates exactly the thing that you're raising, and I'm very pleased it does, because that has been a consistent concern of my government and the National Cabinet more broadly. But Greg, did you want to add?
Yep. Provide one or two examples of what those highly targeted precautions might be. What are we talking about in practical terms?
If I may, look, two things in particular. The most vulnerable population, as we've seen around the world, is those in residential aged care. The residential aged care first dose outcomes at this stage are 88.4% and 84% for second dose. Those are extraordinary levels of protection, and so we'll continue to maintain an absolute focus on those elderly. And that's now backed up with an 86% plus first dose for the over 70 population. That is the single most vulnerable set of people, those in residential aged care and those who are over 70. In terms of Indigenous Australia, what we've seen is an extraordinary acceleration. We stood here with Ken Wyatt only a week and a half ago, and he pointed out that there had been very significant hesitancy, but what we are seeing now is a complete change of mindset across Indigenous Australia, and Ken and so many others have worked to change that. That's being backed up with the uptake of vaccination, and so what I am confident of is that we are seeing and will continue to see a very significant acceleration of vaccination. In New South Wales, for example, 44 RCHOs, 574 primary care sites. Across Australia, what we see is 159 Aboriginal medical services, in over 2,000 primary care sites, all of which are working to support the Indigenous population. They're coming forward. And then another example is, which has been put forward by the West Australian government, is the mining companies who will vaccinate both their own workers on site, but also provide additional support for Indigenous communities who may not have taken up opportunities so far. So there's a very comprehensive plan, important question, but the most vulnerable are protected at the highest level. Indigenous Australia, I'm really pleased to see that the uptake is accelerating.
I'll just finish on this. I want to say thank you to the 335,000 Australians who turned up yesterday. As we continue on this march of hope to 70% and 80% of our population over the age of 16 vaccinated. And I want to convey a very special thank you on behalf of all Australians for those brave souls who are there in Kabul right now, evacuating people who need us more than at any other time in their lives. Thank you for your service. Thank you.